In this video, we're going to see how to automatically generate values for primary keys in an Oracle table using a sequence and a trigger. So the context for this example is a small family counseling practice where we'll be keeping track of information about clients, counselors, and appointments for counseling sessions. For this particular example, we'll just be dealing with the table that we store information about the counselors in. Let's go ahead and create that table. So here, we've got just 4 columns. We have a counselor ID, which will serve as the primary key, first name, a last name, and a telephone number. We'll create that table, and we'll insert some test data. And we'll get 3 records in here and take a look. And so here we have our first 3 counselors. Now the trouble here is that for this counselor ID, we really don't care what the value is as long as it's unique. And here, each insert statement has to have a new value chosen for the primary key. We really don't want an application or an operator to have to think about what might be a valid value for that primary key. And so that's our task today, is to create what's called in Oracle a sequence, which will just be an object that can generate a sequence of numbers. It'll start generating where we tell it to start and increment by how we tell it to increment. Let's take a look at the syntax for creating a sequence. We start off by saying create sequence. We then give it a name. I'll call this one object ID. And then we tell it where to start by saying start with. And then we give it a number. I'll start this one at 100. Then we tell it how to count, how much each time it counts, how many should it count by. And we say that by saying increment by, and then we give it another number, here 1. So this sequence is going to start at 100, should be the first number that it pulls out, should be 100, and then each subsequent request for a number should go up by 1. And so let's go ahead and take a look at how we would see a value from that sequence. We just are going to create a query to request that a value from that sequence out. So we will say select, and then we will refer to the sequence dot next val. So we created this sequence as object ID, and it has a property next val that, or it's a method, I guess, that when we request the next value, it will give us the next value. And now we will say from dual. Dual is just a single table, a single row table that's always available in Oracle for querying things like this. And there it brings us that value of 100. And if we run that query again, it'll bring us the next one, the next one, and the next one. And so the sequence just gives me the next value each time I ask for it. So now our task is that we've created that sequence. We need to connect that sequence up to the counselor table. And to do that, we're going to use a trigger. So here's how we do it. We say create trigger, and we give it a name. And that will work great if the trigger doesn't already exist. But if it does exist, it's going to cause an error because it can't create another trigger by the same name. So fortunately, there's an alternate syntax where we can say create or replace trigger, and then give it a name. That way, if the trigger doesn't exist, it'll create it. If it does exist, it'll override it. Now, we have to tell it when we want it to execute. In this case, we want it to execute before a record is inserted into the table. After all, we need to change the value for the counselor ID. So we want to do that as it's being inserted, but before it gets inserted. So we tell it the event that's going to trigger the trigger and the table that we want it to be on. So by saying before insert on counselor, that's going to indicate that this trigger should be executed as a record is being inserted, but before the record actually makes it to the table. Now, because some insert statements can insert more than one record at a time, we need to be explicit here to say that this is going to execute for every row that's being inserted. And so the syntax for that is we say for each row. And now we begin the trigger. So our task now is to select that value, the next value from the object ID, just as we did before. But we need to actually tell it where to go. So we can't just select it for display on the screen. And so we're going to say that we want to select it into, and we want to put it into the counselor ID. Unfortunately, that counselor ID isn't available to us yet because we haven't actually inserted the record. And so what we're going to do is we're going to prefix that with : new dot. and then put counselor ID. And that's actually the holding space where we have that value. We can look at that value that's trying to be inserted before it's actually inserted. And then we'll put the rest of the query on there. Now we're ready to close off the trigger and execute the trigger to create it. And so now that trigger has been created. And so now whenever we try to insert a record into the counselor table, it's going to invoke that trigger and it's going to place a value onto into the new buffer for the counselor ID. Let's take a look. So here I'm going to insert a new record, counselor's Leslie Wright, and I'm not going to supply a value for the primary key. Normally, that would cause the primary key constraint to reject the record. But because the trigger is going to actually execute and update the new value for the counselor ID before the insert happens, the record should go through just fine. Let's take a look. And so here is that record came in and it pulled the value from the sequence. Well, here's another option. Instead of leaving it blank, I could put another number in, like 1,000. I wonder what will happen there. In fact, the trigger will override that one as well. And as we can see, it will just pull the next value from the trigger. And so if I've specified null for the primary key or any other value for the primary key, the trigger overrides it. But what happens if I don't specify a value at all? Well, I can make an insert statement that doesn't specify a value just by listing the fields that I want to put the values into and omitting the primary key. So I'm just going to insert first name, last name, and phone and supply those values. Again, here the trigger is going to be invoked and choose an appropriate value for the primary key. And so James Sawyer gets executed, or James Sawyer's record gets inserted with an appropriate value for the counselor ID. And that's how Oracle implements automatic sequencing for primary keys. We create a sequence, and then we use that sequence as the basis for a trigger that we put on the insert event for that table.